Hey guys, good evening. Todd Sachs of Sachs Realty. I'm a real estate broker here at Sachs Realty, and we're in Maryland. But we do serve people all over the country through our preferred broker network. But here in Maryland, we help buyers and sellers of both residential and commercial real estate. And this is our brand new podcast we started just 8 weeks ago. We're at episode 8, and it's called Tuesday Night Live. And this is everything and anything real estate. Gives you an opportunity while we're live. This is how it works. If you're watching us live, you want to chat with us, go ahead and do so. If you're watching it after we went live in a pre-recorded session, you can actually email us, and all of our information will be in the show notes. I'm really excited tonight. Not such an exciting topic, but one that's top of mind in real estate. It's all about mold. And with us this evening, we've gone all the way to Florida in one of the moldiest, if that's a thing, states, because of their high humidity. So we have Brad Fishbein, and he has a company called lookmold. And I tell you what, guys, we just started this YouTube thing. So if you're watching on YouTube, you would hit the subscribe and that little bell so that you can get alerted when we go live and post great content like this. But Brad has almost 10,000 subscribers. So you can go ahead and subscribe to him too. He actually has one video that has hit like 1.3 million in views. So we're going to go ahead and bring him in right now. And all the way from Florida, we're talking mold tonight. So Brad, welcome, and tell everybody about you.
Hey, Todd. Nice to meet you. And anyways, so a little bit about me. I have a company here in South Florida called Brownfish Inspections. Now, Brownfish Inspections is my local company, but I also have an online presence, which is lookmold, which you were referring to. Now, lookmold is a website, and I also have a YouTube channel. And I made that channel pretty much for the same reason why you made your channel, is just to kind of inform all the people out there about mold. Basically, there's so much misconception when it comes to mold. Having mold in your house, is it bad for you? All that kind of stuff like that. So I just really wanted to make kind of my piece of evidence supporting, about mold. If it's, how it affects you, how it is in the house, and before you buy real estate, how it is affecting your transaction. So that's why I made that channel and also my website.
I've flipped a bunch of houses, and here in Maryland, we have basements, and I know a lot of the country, you do have basements, or if not, just high humidity. And we know that when systems go down or houses sit vacant, you don't have the power on, air is not circulating, you'll find it. We've actually had it as, as real estate agents, as we're showing properties, sometimes we have to actually get hold of harmlesses, right, filled out, and, buyers to actually sign them before we can even go inside, because some of the houses are so bad. But most of the time we're dealing with it. We're either on the seller side, they have a basement, they have an area where it is, well, we don't want to say that it is mold. We don't want to assume that. But let's go ahead and kind of jump right in, and let's talk about what is mold.
So mold, all it is a fungus. Now it's everywhere. Mold is absolutely everywhere. You go outside, there should be more mold outside than there is in a house. You think about some of the foods that you eat, blue cheese. If you didn't know that comes, that's derived from mold. You think about penicillin, which is used basically to treat people. That is derived from mold. So there's, mold, not all mold is bad, and mold is absolutely everywhere. It's just a fungus. Now, when you're talking about mold in a house, that's what I think people want to know. What is mold in a house? That's basically when you have some kind of wet, damaged building material, and you'll have mold, which is everywhere. It'll start to grow on that wet building material, and it can start to cause issues from there. So that's when you're talking about mold. And if you look on the screen right now, you'll see exactly that is mold. That's the type of mold that you do not want to see. Mold is everywhere, though. You go outside and you'll be breathing in mold spores for sure.
Yeah, I've actually I have gone into properties before where, and I'll just, kind of tell a little story here. One of my agents and myself went to a home where the people that were living in it were actually, they didn't have the money to fix up the hole in the roof. And it had been raining in the house. And they literally had a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket in the living room where, when it rained, it wasn't catching it in this bucket. I mean, it was spilling everywhere. And when we walked into the house, we could really smell it. And, so he hadn't said anything about it, but he had, children that were living in the house. And when we went down in the basement, I mean, it was literally breathtaking. You couldn't breathe, and it was growing off of the walls inches. I mean, it was actually growing. So the big question is it dangerous?
Now, it can be. Mold can absolutely be dangerous. There's certain types of mold. You hear about the black toxic mold. There's no such thing as black mold. Black mold is something, it's a media term. The type of mold that they're referring to is called Stachybotrys. Say that real quick 5 times, but yeah, there you go. Stachybotrys. But Stachybotrys is what they're referring to when you say black mold, but there's no scientific name. Many mold come in many different colors, and Stachybotrys comes in other colors besides black. But the real thing is mold can be dangerous because what happens is when it starts to basically use cellulose-based products like drywall as a food source, it can start to off gas. Now, that's something called mycotoxins, and that's what can be really, really dangerous for people. Now, there's other types of mold that don't produce mycotoxins, but people can still have allergic reactions. So yes, to answer your question, mold can be dangerous. Doesn't mean all mold is dangerous. Like I said, we eat mold. We use it as medicine. But when you're talking about, mold that grows from water damage, yes, it can absolutely be very dangerous and not fun to look at, like that basement you were just talking about.
So does it start out? I mean, you refer to, I guess, the way that people refer to it as black mold is because a lot of times it is black. Does it start out with a different color?
It can. Mold comes in all different colors. You can see it in white. I've seen it in yellow, orange, brown. It comes in all different colors. Now, black mold you can find black mold just on a surface sometimes, and it can not be dangerous at all. It can be just a little bit of surface mold on, a piece of material that was, a little bit wet from humidity. So it doesn't start out as black. It can start out as white. It can start out as all different colors. The color sometimes is irrelevant. Now, Stachybotrys does kind of have a distinct look sometimes, not all the time, where, it can basically be determined by the eye, but you need some kind of lab results to be sure that it is Stachybotrys. So
we're going to get into like the testing and things like that. You're talking about labs, and I know there are, different things that are on the shelf, and we'll talk about those. But let's, I have to tell you, I mean, I know that at certain times when I'm in houses that you can really see the mold, I know that I feel affected. Sometimes, like when I left the property that I was just referring to where the mold, I mean, it was breathtaking. And for hours later, my agent and myself, we actually were complaining that we had like a sore throat, like a scratchy throat. But I have to tell you, as a real estate broker, and I've looked at, online. I mean, obviously, I've Googled, mold, the dangers and things like that. And there's a lot. It's a very controversial topic. And, people say that there's a lot of different ways that you can deal with it. And we'll discuss that as well, sort of like the home remedy stuff. And then when you need to call in the professionals. But are you familiar with what the dangers are?
Yeah. So as far as what the dangers are now, this can vary from person to person. Think about it like this, and I don't want to get into this whole topic, but think about the coronavirus, right? You have some people that are saying that it's nothing. You have other people that are very scared of it. Some people that are saying, that it's very dangerous. They may have had the virus and they know firsthand that it's dangerous. It's the same thing with mold. There's certain people that have had the coronavirus where their immune system just kind of kicks it out and it's no big deal. So their thoughts are, hey, I didn't have any kind of symptoms. No big deal. But then there's a certain part of the population that can experience issues. They say that 20% of the people from 20% of the population of people can have some kind of mold allergies and can be susceptible to issues with mold exposure. So the dangers of mold kind of varies from person to person. You can get very sick. I've seen people that are very, very sick, and we come to find out there was a huge mold problem in their home that they did not know about, and they were living there for a long period of time. So it's really a case-by-case basis. It can be very dangerous to one's health, especially if you have autoimmune issues. Now, it can also it can be a trigger for a lot of people as well. I have one client that had lupus, a lifelong, they've had lupus pretty much their whole life, you know what I mean, since I think early adulthood. And this lady, she was probably in her early 50s or so, and she was fine for about 10 years. And she moved into a place with mold, and it really just brought out the lupus in her, I guess you could say. It really just kicked her into high gear. So it can be a trigger as well. So yeah, there are dangers to mold for sure.
And then I hear, and I'm no doctor, guys, so
me neither.
Right. I mean, right. There's definitely no MD medical doctor behind I think either one of our names. So, but I mean, obviously, reading things, I hear people with asthma that this could be very problematic.
Of course. So just to cut you off real quick about asthma. With asthma, you have these large spaces on your lungs. So there's a certain type of mold spore called aspergillus. And there's a disease that comes from it called aspergillosis. It tends to grow on people with asthma. And the reason why is because they have these large spaces in their lungs. So you actually have mold growing on your lungs when you have asthma. Inside your body, you have mold growing that can grow right on your lungs. So, but listen, I'm in aspergillus all day. I have no kind of issues like that. I do not have asthma. So that's why I'm telling you, it varies from person to person. One person may experience, really be very ill from mold, where someone like myself or someone like you may not have no issues.
Yeah. And then the other thing is I hear young children.
Yeah. Young children too. There's been studies behind that. And a lot of times that's people that are allergic to one particular type of mold spore. If kids are allergic to that particular type of mold spore, they probably didn't have any kind of allergy testing at that point in time, so they don't realize it. But Stachybotrys, there's been studies. I don't know if you heard about the Cleveland drop case. It's kind of big in real estate.
No.
It's going back towards the 80s. And there was a case of SIDS, I think, sudden infant death syndrome that was linked to Stachybotrys in Cleveland. So there are some real dangers to mold.
How did they link it? How did they link it back? Do you know?
I got to look up the case. This was going back to when I originally, learned about mold. I know it's a famous case. It's called the Cleveland drop case. I don't know the specifics of it, but it was linked to Stachybotrys, and that's really where the term black mold came from. And also Ed McMahon, you would know him better than me.
What do you say, man?
Yeah.
What do you say? I'm older than you.
I mean, listen, Jay Leno and David Letterman is my generation. But...
Hey, man, I remember Ed McMahon. Yeah, it's like the publisher's, sweepstakes.
Yep,
clearing out sweepstakes. He's going to knock on my door and give me $1 million or something.
That's actually how I know Ed McMahon. But he almost died from having Stachybotrys in his house as well. So
wow.
Yeah, it's one of those things that that was kind of a big lawsuit that came about, I believe. So that's really where the term black mold came from, is those two cases.
Interesting. So I know you kind of touched on this, and you're talking about that Stachybotrys, or did I say that right?
Stachybotrys, you got it.
Yeah. Okay. I can't wait to the next sales meeting.
Butcher it all day.
I can let everybody know that I know what Stachybotrys mold is.
Actually, today someone says Stachybotrys.
Stachybotrys. Okay. We don't want any of the Stachybotrys.
Yeah.
What other types of mold? I mean, is Stachybotrys solely indoors, or is it an outside mold as well?
Yeah, Stachybotrys. Now, there's a handful of molds that produce mycotoxins, which is really what gets you sick. The mold really only gets you sick if you have an allergy to that particular type of mold. Sometimes, it can give you some stuff such as stuffy noses and stuff of that nature. But when you get real sick, it's not necessarily the mold per se, it's the mycotoxins. And Stachybotrys, That's one of a few molds that generally you won't find outdoors. You'll only find indoors with water damaged building material that can cause the mycotoxins. So yeah, it won't grow generally outdoors. The real bad type of mold only kind of grows in areas that have been water damaged on cellulose-based products like porous building materials. Drywall is really where mold can thrive on. So there's many different types of mold, though. There's literally 365,000 types of mold. Only a small handful.
1,000 for every day of the year.
The year.
365,000 different types of mold.
But not generally found indoors. I mean, when you get my lab reports, when my clients get my lab reports, it lists probably about, I don't know, 25 to 35 types of mold that you'll generally find indoors.
Is it true? So I've heard home inspectors say that when you open the door, mold spores are coming in.
100%. 100%. Now that's how mold gets in. Like I said, mold is everywhere, Todd. Mold's outdoors, mold's indoors. Mold's probably on this shirt that I'm wearing right now. It's probably on that red tie you got on right now. It's probably nice and moldy. It's really everywhere. What happens is, here's how mold grows. So mold, like I said, is everywhere. It's going to come into the house, either be from outside or from your, clothing, whatever, even on your dog's fur, mold spores can be. And what it's going to do is it's going to attach itself to wet building material. Now, let's just say you have a roof leak. Under the right conditions, which is generally 65% humidity or higher, actually they say 60% humidity or higher, mold can really start to grow. And once it starts to grow, it starts to colonize on that wet building material. So it needs a food source. You need three things for mold. You need water, you need something for it to grow on, and humidity, which is also water in itself. But humidity is water in the air compared to actual, water, say from a pipe leak or something like that. So it needs, mold needs, wet building material. Humidity is really big. So without humidity, mold will not really stand a chance.
So how do you prevent mold from growing? I mean, you just turn your air conditioning on, or I mean,
One thing. So the way to prevent mold in your house comes down to one thing and one thing only, and that's controlling moisture in your house. Whether it be, your air conditioner. Now, your air conditioner, it kind of acts, a lot of people think that it just cools, and that's true. It does cool, but especially here in South Florida and probably in Maryland too, where you are, where it's humid.
We're very humid.
Yeah, it's very humid. So what a big, function of the HVAC system is to pull moisture out of the air. You should not need an external dehumidifier this day and age. Your air conditioning should be pulling out enough moisture. So if your air conditioning is running properly, you should be able to prevent mold from growing in regards to humidity. Now, let's just say you have some kind of flood in your house. I know you've probably known somebody or had it, done yourself. What happens is you call your insurance company and they bring over, they'll call like a Serv Pro is a big company to come dry out the area. Now, what they're doing, quickly. They'll get there in the middle of the night, and they love that in the middle of the night because they make a killing. They charge your insurance company a lot of money to come there in the middle of the night, so they love that. But
time's of the essence at that point.
The time is of the essence. Absolutely, the time is of the essence. So when you have a leak, you need to get air blowers, big industrial air blowers in there, and big fans that will dry the areas out. You'll see them sometimes pull off baseboards. They'll put holes in the wall so it'll dry out the inner walls so mold won't grow. Mold doesn't stand a chance if you can dry it out quickly. So between industrial air movers and also dehumidifiers, you can really dry out an area if you have a leak. Now, the real bad type of mold happens when you really don't know you have a leak. Just think about this, Todd. If you ever had a roof leak, you don't really know until you start seeing staining on the ceiling. That doesn't mean it wasn't there for 3 months before that. It might just start rearing its head as the leak's getting a little bit bigger. So, or you may not go in that room enough. So that's when the real bad mold grows, is when you have a leak and you don't know about it.
So you just made a great point here. So I always think of mold being in, and obviously if the house isn't occupied and there's no air circulation, I mean, we see it sometimes in some of these bank-owned properties, foreclosed properties where they haven't lived in there for sometimes a year or more, and mold is everywhere. But you're saying that we could have mold in our attics.
Absolutely. And it's not the end of the world. I actually will guarantee you have mold in your attic, unless you have, and I don't know as far as how Maryland construction is done. Down here, foam insulation along the roof line is kind of a big thing. Icing insulation. I don't know about other, areas. And what that does, the reason why it's so big down here is it keeps your attic pretty much the same, temperature and humidity, maybe a little bit more than the living space. It's actually considered a living space. We seal up the attics. And the reason for that is
we don't do that so much. We're really putting it, in the rafters or in the trusses and things like that, known as an attic blanket, is where we're kind of putting the insulation.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, we're doing that more and more along the roof line now. The downside of having the icing insulation is that sometimes you can't tell there's a leak until it's become, really, really a lot of water coming through. So you can have some serious roof issues that will lead to bigger problems. But the point I'm making is, you can have absolutely some kind of mold in your attic. Think about your air conditioning system, especially during the summer where it's 90 degrees, your attic is 140 degrees. Your air conditioning system, think about it like a person. When you go for a run and you're running hard in hot weather, what happens? You start to sweat. Same thing with the air conditioning. When the air conditioning is running, especially when it's a little bit older and your ductwork is a little bit worn, it starts to sweat. So you start having some kind of, dripping from the ductwork, and that can create issues. You have probably bats insulation along, the back part of the ceiling.
Yes, it could be blown in, but most of it's
blown in is better. I hate blown in as an inspector, but it's much better to have blown in. The reason why is because bats insulation has paper on the backside. And what happens is, even though your drywall is not getting wet, your insulation is, and that paper is getting wet, and mold can start to grow on the actual insulation paper. And I saw that a lot this summer because it was so hot here in South Florida. So,
yeah. I mean, I kind of thought, you're really teaching me something here because, I kind of thought that it needed to be damp and cool, for like a basement. I didn't realize that we could actually have these issues in the extreme heat, because it's more dry. But as you're saying, the moisture starts to mold, and I guess the heat doesn't have anything to do with it.
No, not necessarily. Extreme cold generally won't be that humid. I mean, certain months, Alaska is actually one of the most humid states, believe it or not. But I think that's like the end of the summer, like, around this time of year, basically. It's very humid in Alaska. But no, it's humidity. It's not necessarily heat. It's not necessarily cold or anything like that. It's humidity. That's where mold can grow. You can have an environment that's very cold, but be very humid. So that's why you may walk into a house and feel like, oh my God, it's so hot in here. You look at a thermometer and it's only 78 degrees, but your humidity is also 78 degrees. So it feels hotter than it really is because it's so humid.
Yeah.
Humidity is the big thing.
So what about, let's just kind of talk about it. We're really going to get into now, how to deal with it and, what buyers and sellers should be looking for and concerned about. But when you walk in, and I was just with a buyer over the weekend, and soon as we walked into the place, she said, I can smell mold. I couldn't smell it. It may have had something to do with our masks, but she could smell it. Does the musty smell, is it always a sign that there's mold?
So I have a business that basically thrives because of that reason. I have so many buyers, especially vacant homes. They'll walk in and the first thing they say, like you said, is I smell mold. Now what they're smelling is moisture. It also can be stagnant air as well. I went into a house just, when was it? Last Friday, where you walk in and there was kind of like an odor. This house was sitting vacant for about 8 months or so. The air conditioning was running, but it was set on 80, which is very high down here. Yeah, so it really wasn't running all that often. so there wasn't a lot of air movement. A home should have many air exchanges. When you open a door, you should have an air exchange. When your air conditioning is running, it provides air exchanges. So you need to have air exchanges within a home. So just because you have a musty odor in a home doesn't always indicate there's mold. It could indicate there's mold. It might be mold you're smelling, or it could just be a little bit of moisture, because of humidity, which doesn't always indicate a mold problem per se. It could mean there's a little bit more mold spores there for sure, especially if you have carpet. Now, carpet, to me, is one of the biggest enemies from, actually, I shouldn't say enemies, one of the biggest allies for mold, because, mold spores will hang out in carpets, and not even just mold, even dust particles, everything will hang out in carpets. And it doesn't always come up easily, even when you vacuum. Sometimes mold spores are so small that a regular vacuum, you need a special kind of vacuum that will be able to pick up these kind of mold spores. So, carpet to me is tough to have here in South Florida. Now, I have carpet. If you look here in my room, I have carpet in my bedrooms in my house because I like to have carpet, when I get up in the middle of the night or when I get up in the morning. But everything else, if you have allergies, you should not get a house with carpet, or you should not keep the floors in place. But to go back, I went off topic a little bit, but
no, it's fine. I mean, look, you have carpet, you're a mold guy. I mean, you might like mold. I don't know. I mean,
no, I do not. Let me just tell you, I do not
you
like
might
mold.
want the mold. You may be doing, experiments. I don't know.
I'm not doing weird things with mold.
Oh.
but I do a lot of real estate transactions, and that's one of the questions I get a lot. And no, a musty smell doesn't always indicate mold. It could mean you just have old carpets in place. It could mean the previous owner or the current owner is not running their air conditioner a lot. So
does it? I've never gotten up on it and smelled it. I mean, does mold actually have a smell?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it sometimes it's very much like that musty smell.
I mean, you've gotten close to it. You've actually put your nose at it and smelled the mold.
So I know basically 75 to 80% of the time, the minute I walk into a house, whether there's a mold problem at this point in time, just based on the way it smells. And then there's some houses I'll walk into. I went into one today actually that I know I'm gonna have to dig around because there's nothing visible. One thing that kind of in this particular house that I went to today, what we believe, and further investigation does need to be done, it was the issue is something called positive air pressure. Now, what's happening is there was a hole, or what I think there's a hole in the ductwork where the trunk line is. So it's blowing cold air into the wall cavities, and what it's doing is it's blowing air, wall cavity air that's not air conditioned into the living space. So it's kind of creating a musty odor that way, which can be mold because there's probably going to be mold inside some of the walls. So I have a nose for it at this point. If you're buying a house and you do not have a nose for it, you should probably have a mold inspection, just because you're making an investment into a property. Your home is going to be one of your most expensive things that you ever buy. So to spend a couple $100, whatever it costs, for a mold inspection, if that's something you're concerned with that musty odor, you should definitely hire a mold inspector.
Yeah, well, that was my next question here. So, if you're buying a house, first of all, and we'll talk about the buyers first here, but if you're buying a house, do you recommend, I mean, obviously you're an inspector and I know you're not going to answer this based on just being an inspector, but, do you recommend that all buyers get a mold test?
It's based upon the house you're buying and the type of person you are. If you're worried about mold, like I said, spend the $500 extra bucks, whatever, it's going to cost for the mold inspection on that house. I have clients that randomly ask me, hey, should I get my house tested for mold every year? My answer is always no. You should have your house tested for mold, when you think you have a mold problem. Now, I'll gladly take your money if you want to test your house for mold every year, but you should not test your house for mold unless you think there is a mold issue in the home, or if it's something you just want peace of mind. I can't tell you how much of my business, I would say 70% of my business over the course of the past 2 years has turned into real estate transactions. And the reason why is because people just want peace of mind. You hear all these horror stories about mold. Like you said, you go online and you type in mold into Google, and all these crazy things come up on both sides of the spectrum. You have people saying no big deal, people saying you're going to die if you have mold in your house. You have complete opposite ends. So,
well, the banks are scared of it. I mean, when we see the banks, when we see,
absolutely,
yeah, when we see, a bank-owned property, and they know, that somebody has gone through, taken pictures, let them know what that asset looks like, what kind of condition it's in. If it has mold, I mean, it's disclosed everywhere.
So that's how I got into the industry.
And that's really what we see. The big hold harmless. Like, if you want to enter this house, this has mold, and they're just protection. If you're a real estate agent and you're going into somebody's basement or somebody's home, and you see that it looks like there's even the slightest, smallest section, and sometimes we see it like around basement windows and things like that. Would you say at that point they should get a test?
So what you're looking at on the screen right now, that's just a little bit of surface mold from condensation building up on, it looks like that's probably a piece of metal. Just if you're seeing something like that, well, it looks like there's something underneath. That's not always going to be a mold problem per se. Now,
you wouldn't look at that and be overly concerned and say, look, we got to get a mold test.
I want to see what's under it, on the drywall under it. I'm just looking at the windowsill.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So, it's really, listen, you have types of products. You have metal, think about metal. Mold is, even though you'll see it like on your your vents, your ceiling vents for your air conditioning, mold doesn't really grow on metal because metal is not porous. It'll grow on the surface of metal. It'll hang out there, but it's not going to grow and thrive on actual metal. It's not using it as a food source. So therefore, it's generally not going to be any kind of dangerous issue. It can usually be cleaned with a simple, biodegradable solution. It's drywall and, wood products, anything porous that you got to be concerned with mold growing on. Now, just to kind of touch what you were saying about the REOs, that's how I got into the industry. I had a property management company back in 2007, right before the market, took a dump. And I got in really at the right time doing that. I was going to these bank-owned properties and changing the locks, boarding the windows. And then all of a sudden the market crashed and my business just blew up. And what they would have me do is go in there and start testing it for mold so they can mark it as uninhabitable. So they could give those hold harmlesses. So that's when you said that, that's basically how I got into the industry. And then when the market kind of came back, I went to school for it and everything. I kind of went the private sector route. And that's how I got in it. But to answer your question, sorry, I went off in a tangent. I just kind of.
It's okay.
Yeah. So, but to answer your question, really, you want to look out for mold on porous building material. That's when you can identify when you're probably having some kind of mold problem. Now, the thing with some wall covering, especially you go into older houses, they have plaster. Now, plaster is lime based, and it generally does not support mold growth. The thing with plaster is, you have plaster on the front side and you have a base. The base, if that, down here, 1950s, if you have a house in the 1950s that has plaster, there's a good chance you have mold on the backside because it has drywall. It has drywall holding up the plaster. So there's a mix of plaster and drywall in 1950s houses. Usually 1920s, 30s, and 40s houses are actually built to withstand mold more because they don't have as much porous building material. I rarely find issues unless it's under the crawl space. So
let's talk about it. And I want to get back to that, by the way. And so, I definitely want to touch on what happens when the mold is between the outside sheathing or including the outside sheathing and the inside or that insulation. You can't see it, right. But I do want to talk about that when we get to what happens when you hire the pros like yourself. But let's first, we're asked a lot about the off-the-shelf mold test kits, the little Petri, dishes, kind of that type of test. Are they accurate?
So what they test for is mold. Yes, they're accurate in terms of it's growing mold in the Petri dish. but of course you have mold. There's mold everywhere. So
Okay.
yeah, are they accurate to whether you have a mold problem? Absolutely not. The Petri dishes, I'm not a big fan of them. Now, there is one product out there that I do recommend on my website. If you did want to do an at-home mold test, it's called My Mold Detective. My Mold Detective is basically a cheap version of one of the tools that I use to take mold samples. It's to take air quality samples. And what it does is it takes in, it's like a negative air pump, and it takes in usually about 75 to 150 liters of air into a little cassette. I don't have one here, but into a little cassette, and over a period of 5 or 10 minutes, and then it gets sent off to a laboratory. And what that does is basically like taking a picture of the air that moment in time. It's telling me how much mold is in the air in that particular area and what kind of mold. Those are accurate because that's kind of a form of one of the type of tests I use. But those Petri dishes, I do not recommend it, and they're going to scare you. They're going to scare you as a homeowner.
Yeah, well, what you're saying is if every time you're opening up the door, actual mold spores come in, I guess they would quickly collect in those Petri dishes. So if you're going to use that, maybe you're going to see mold all the time.
Absolutely.
So not necessarily. So that's interesting. And by the way, we are going to publish all of Brad's information. His website, he actually has, it's like a self-assessment kind of thing too, right, Brad? That I saw on your website. Was it like a questionnaire or something?
Yeah,
checklist. Yep, checklist. Yep. So, can somebody? I know, and I will say, if anybody checks out Brad's YouTube, man, what controversy you raised, man, on that video that you have like 1.3 million views. I was checking out some of the comments on it, and people were like, it's like, calm down, guys. We're just talking about mold. It doesn't mean that you can't deal with it in other ways, or, everybody has an opinion on whether you can or cannot get rid of it in these different fashions. And we're going to talk about some of those, but can someone get rid of this stuff themselves?
Sure. So it really depends, actually, I should say. The EPA, they recommend doing it yourself if you have smaller than 10 square feet, which is 3x3 area. Now, there's so much of a gray area when it comes to that, because sometimes the mold can be airborne, and you don't know how much you're going to encounter when you open up a wall cavity. So it really depends. If you're talking about having just a little bit of mold on the air vent, Todd, sure, you can remove that yourself. If you have just a little bit of mold on a small piece of baseboard that got wet, go ahead and remove it yourself. When you're talking about, removing, having a big time roof leak or having a big time window leak, you should really, I urge you to really at least have a mold inspector look at it. And you don't even have to take the mold inspector's recommendations for any kind of remediation companies or anything, but get a third party in there. Remediation company is always going to find a problem. They'll do free assessments. Keep in mind, nobody works for free. And I'm not saying all remediation guys are bad. I know a small handful, but I know a handful of mold remediation guys that are very, very honest and won't take advantage of people. But keep in mind, when you call a mold remediation company to come there and take a look at something, chances are they'll probably find something. I actually like it when I hear that a mold remediation company charged $150 for an assessment instead of a free assessment, because then they're at least getting paid for their time, so they don't have to make something up. Yeah, I mean, you need to have a mold inspection. If you think you have a mold problem, that's going to be more than just kind of a little bit of mold on a baseboard or a little bit of mold on the outside of your air conditioning system. You should really have it done professionally. There's levels to it. Listen, there's levels to it. Like I said, everybody's going to have a certain amount of mold in their house. Everybody's going to have some kind of water intrusion at some point in time. Rarely do I walk into a house when I do a mold report and the mold report be completely blank. Sometimes I'll be able to point out something, whether it needs mold remediation or not. That's a different story. But I'll point out, visible staining around a vent, visible, small visible staining on a window reveal or something like that. So it's really levels to it. If you think you have a mold problem, you should definitely get it checked out. Having a mold inspector like myself come before, sometimes it's unnecessary. If you know you have a mold problem, if you're staring at the ceiling and it looks like one of those pictures you showed earlier with the mold on the ceiling, Yeah, skip me.
Skip the inspector.
Yeah, skip the inspector. Don't pay me to come out there. Pay have a remediation company come out there. Call your insurance company or whatever whatever steps you plan on taking. You don't need.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you said that. I think that's great advice. I mean, obviously, if you walk in and you go, "Whoa," like look at this mold, or you're signing a hold harmless to go inside. You may skip the inspector to say, do we have a problem or not? You might know that you do and go to the remediation route. I have to ask this, and this was the big controversy in your big video with 1.3 million views. Does bleach work for mold?
Okay.
I can't tell you how many contractors, they get a gallon of bleach, they put it in a little spray bottle, they pump it up, they spray it all around. Sometimes they have the respirator on, sometimes they don't. Does it work?
I built a reputation for myself over my defense of not using bleach to kill mold. Now, people missed the entire point of that video. The point of that video, and it was my fault the way I labeled the video. The name of the video is "How to Kill Black Mold in 5 Minutes." So what I'm basically telling in the beginning of the video is ways that you can kill black mold. But if you look towards the end of not even towards the end, towards the middle of the video, I basically do a reveal. I'd say, the biggest secret of the mold industry is you can't just kill black mold. And the reason why, and I use the term black mold really to attract people because that's what people use. But I personally, myself, don't use that term.
You call it Stachybotrys.
Right. But black mold is a trigger word for a lot of consumers that, are uninitiated. So, but anyways, my whole point to that video was if you have black mold, you cannot just kill it. You can't just kill it. Whether it be bleach, whether it be any kind of fungicide, if you have Stachybotrys in your house, it needs to be removed and it needs to be done professionally, because that type of mold, if you are removing that and not professionally, you can spread those spores throughout the entire house. And that, dead mold spores, like I said, can affect you just as much as living mold spores. So you really, really, really do not want to mess with black mold. And that was my point of that video. So now back to your question, does bleach work for mold? There's been studies that bleach can work on the surface of non-porous building material. So if you have a piece of plastic that has mold on it, just because it's been in an attic for 6 years, yeah, you can use bleach. That'll take it right off. Bleach is a biocide, especially industrial bleach. Now, the studies I was referring to says that bleach will not penetrate a lot of building material, especially wood. So it'll kill everything on the surface, but it won't actually kill something called the microflora inside the wood. It won't penetrate surfaces. So there's better things that you can use for bleach to kill mold. But bleach will kill mold on the surface. Don't use bleach. I mean, bleach is not necessarily healthy for human consumption either. That's why you have to wear a mask. There's so many green biodegradable stuff that you can use instead of having bleach. One thing I used recently is vital oxide. Is something called vital oxide. Concrobrium, which you can buy over at Home Depot. Microban is the big product that most remediation companies use. You can buy that at any janitorial supply store. There's a dime a dozen. There's just so many products that you can use instead.
Do you have these on your website? I mean, do you actually have the
I have it on the checklist. I have product. I do. There's certain things I mentioned in passing. I don't think I have a page dedicated just to products for to kill mold. But again, killing mold is not always the objective. Getting rid of mold, especially when you have a mold problem, is really the big thing. And that's what I was really getting at in that video. And people just kind of attach themselves to the bleach thing. So I call myself defending myself, when it comes to bleach, and really had nothing to do with bleach, the video, but people took it that way, which is fine.
So how about just a question that I have here? If you improve the conditions that were causing the mold in the first place, will it just go away on its own?
No, no. So it can remain dormant, but keep in mind that dead mold can affect you just as much as living mold. So um, let's just say you've had some kind of leak, a roof leak, and eventually you let it dry out naturally. You fix the leak on the roof, and you're running your air conditioning. That mold is still there. It's still sitting there dormant. And sometimes dead mold is actually worse than living mold. And the reason why is living mold needs water to survive. When dead mold doesn't have water, it becomes lighter. It doesn't have water weighing it down. I walk into places sometimes where you can see there's a visible big stain of mold along the ceiling, and I'll take an air sample, and I'll get nothing on the air sample. Now I'll get something on the swab sample I take, but I'll get nothing on the air sample. And the reason for that is the spores are so heavy that my air sample machine just won't pick it up. So yeah, I mean, that just because you fix the conditions doesn't necessarily mean the mold problem is completely gone.
Yeah, I didn't know if you
took the first step,
sprayed that surface, improved whatever, but you're saying it's still there. So you brought us into, and the question is, even before we get into what the remediation experts do, kind of tell everybody what you do. You had just said that you do the air test, you do a swab. Can you walk us through, once you get to the home, and you go in, or do you do an outside look first to see if there's evidence of bad drainage? What take us down the path of, what an inspector will do?
Sure. So I'm a mold assessor. Here in South Florida, we have two categories of the mold industry. You have mold assessors and mold remediators. Mold assessors simply just go in and kind of diagnose the problem. When I come to a job site, the first thing I do is exactly what you just said. I walk around the outside of the house. I'm looking for bad drainage. I love it when it rains during my inspections because I can see the drainage and I can see obviously any kind of leaks. And then I'm looking around all the windows. I'm seeing, is there an issue with the caulking? I'm looking for any cracks in the stucco. I'm looking basically for anything that can identify water intrusion because that's where the really bad mold can grow. So when I get into a house, I kind of develop a plan first. Now, most people want me taking air quality samples, which is fine. Air quality, like I said, air quality is great. And it's really bailed me out a few times finding hidden issues. But air quality, people sometimes put too much stock into that. My visual inspection to me is the most important thing that I do because I do something called moisture mapping around all windows, all doors, all plumbing fixtures. I'll take a look at the air conditioned ducts. I'll take a look at the air conditioned coils. I'll take a walk in the attic. If I'm seeing an issue with, any kind of duct work, I'll take a peek at that in the attic, where it could be dripping on the insulation. My visual inspection is much more important to me, and that will sometimes tell me I need to do a little bit more sampling, whether it be a swab sample. One thing I've been doing more and more of is dust sampling. You'll hear about, if you read about, it's called ERMI sampling. And what that does, I don't necessarily do the ERMI for the dust samples all the time. Sometimes I do, but a dust sample will sometimes tell me past issues. It's not going to, air samples are just going to tell me what's in the air at that moment in time. Settled dust is going to tell me what's been in the air. So if I find in the corner of a room some kind of settled dust and I take a sample on it and there's a lot of mold spores in that dust sample, that tells me there could have been a previous issue in that house. So as far as every house is different. Real estate transactions, I'll generally just do a plan based upon what me and the client talk about. Do they want every single room tested? I'll test every single room. Do they want, swab testing on any kind of visible mold? I'll go ahead and do that. So there's really just every house, if I'm going for a real estate transaction, obviously I can't start doing something called wall cavity samples, which is plugging a little hole into the wall and putting a tube behind there to see if there's mold behind the wall.
Which was my point I was going to ask. Like a lot of times like stucco homes and things like that, where they have, issues where the stucco is, has, deteriorated and you can see where there's moisture penetration that's actually gone into the sheathing.
Right.
What do you do in those situations?
So if I find moisture there, It really depends. If the guy owns the house, if the guy or the woman owns the house, I'll say, listen, I want to punch a hole through this wall, and I want to take a wall cavity sample. And I have a little hand tool. I'll just make a kind of a little hole the size of a dime, maybe even smaller. And I'll put a tube behind there, and I'll take an air sample actually behind the wall, and it's going to tell me how much mold is behind the wall. If it's a real estate, transaction, especially, as you probably know better than anyone, sellers would not like to have their walls opened up. So I'll just kind of tell the buyer, hey, listen, you need further investigation. I'll recommend get a mold professional in there, cut an area, less than 1 by 6-inch radius around, see if there's mold inside the actual wall cavity.
Yeah, sellers definitely don't like
sellers
to hear
definitely do not.
Yeah.
Sellers do not like to hear that they have mold, period. Every seller I've ever talked to has 0 mold spores in their house.
Yeah, exactly. And they say, you know what, believe me, we have allergies. And if there were any mold spores in the house, we would know about it. And, I'm with you. I mean, that's, definitely. So what do the remediation companies do? So and I guess more importantly, is this toxic waste? I mean, so when they're cutting out those areas or doing different things and just kind of, can they just throw that stuff in the landfill? Normally, I know it sounds kind of stupid to ask that, but it's a genuine question.
So as far as when they have to build a containment in the house, because like I said, some of this mold will produce toxins. Some of it is toxic. So they can't just cut it out with, open, right there in the middle of the living room. They need to build something called the containment barrier, and they need to shut down the air conditioning system so it's not blowing it everywhere. When they dispose of it, they'll generally take it to a landfill. They should take it to a landfill. I hope they do, and not just throw it in the regular trash, because yes, it is toxic. So, they do need to get rid of it, but they need to make sure the most important, and that's why you have a mold remediation instead of a handyman do it, is because it's not rocket science, but there is a technique to it. You need, mold remediation is an art form. Some of the best mold there is such thing as a bad mold remediator. The whole objective of mold remediation is not to cross-contaminate other areas of the house when removing the water damage building material. So what they do is, they come in there and they'll make sure that they don't cross-contaminate and affect the rest of the house when removing the mold, and they should get rid of it the right way.
I've seen some, so when they cut that out, that's one way to deal with it. What happens in an extreme situation where, I've seen home inspectors, kind of take off the vent, the duct vent, and stick their hand up inside and kind of feel around to see if there's any mold within the ductwork. What happens? I mean, how do you handle something like that when you're talking about now it's inside the ductwork, or perhaps in, the furnace itself, or, heat exchanger? What do you do then?
Well, so one of the most, pretty much the way that mold spores are dispersed through a house. Let's just say you have a water damage issue in one room, from a window leak, and it's producing mold spores that are airborne. How it gets dispersed throughout the house, something like that. How it gets dispersed throughout the house would be, through the air conditioning system. It's a transportation tool. So air conditioning systems can definitely have mold in it. And what you're talking about is kind of the duct cleaning sector of it. Mold is going to grow in an HVAC system over a period of time. It's just the way it is. You can generally clean it. Now, in certain cases, if you go to my website, you'll be able to see, I think I have one post where you can see you just cannot salvage it. You can't salvage anything, and you need to actually replace the ductwork. But that's that's a different scenario. I'm more worried about the invisible mold spores that you can't see with the naked eye that's being dispersed throughout the house due to water damage. But you can generally have your ducts. If you have mold inside your ducts, you can have them cleaned. Now, luckily, the type of mold that will grow inside ductwork is called cladosporium. These molds, this type of mold is generally pretty clunky and doesn't become airborne quite as easily as other spores. They're kind of clunky and heavy. So, you have two different things. You have mold that's transported through the air conditioning system, and then you have mold that's growing inside your ductwork that can either be cleaned or, in extreme cases, removed.
What's with the air circulating thing that's supposed to capture the spores or whatever? I mean, is that hocus pocus?
No, air purification system. So they use a big form of that in the remediation project process called air scrubbers. Now, air scrubbers, what it does is it catches all the mold spores on a HEPA filter and basically blows out clean air. You have all sorts of air purifiers, and some of them will work great, but they're a Band-Aid. That's not your solution if you have a mold problem. It'll help, especially if you have allergies. There are certain ones that you can have in your room when you're sleeping. If you wake up with a stuffy nose, it's not a bad idea. They're definitely not hocus pocus. They'll capture airborne particles, not even just mold, dust and pet dander and stuff of that nature. So, I suggest air purifiers for people that have allergy issues in general, for sure.
So we only have a couple minutes left, and we know that you work with a lot of investors and people maybe that are renting houses or what have you, and they should be concerned about the air quality. Do you have any tips for landlords and flippers, as far as dealing with this? Call the pros, don't do it themselves. I mean, things that you've said, but anything else that we've missed?
So, this, I can do a whole hour on this in general, is landlord tenant stuff. If you have tenants, if you're a landlord and you have tenants, or if you're a tenant and you have a landlord that's not, you guys generally will see mold from a completely separate light. I actually don't take on tenant landlord jobs anymore just because of that. But you should have a third party come in there and just kind of make a decision, because in many cases, tenants will think that it's the end of the world. In many cases, landlord will think it's nothing. So you got to kind of meet in the middle there. So, I've been to litigation a few times for tenant landlord stuff, and it's not fun. That's why I don't do it anymore. For investors, listen, I mean, you have an obligation to give a clean house. So if you do have a mold problem, please don't cut it out yourself. Please don't just remove that. The thing with mold remediation is it's not as expensive if the house is completely, vacant, because you don't have to worry about cross-contaminating, getting anybody sick, and you can just treat the entire home. So in some cases, to have a mold remediation company come in there and do the sanitization is not as expensive. It is a cost, but you should factor that in. You should find out when you're buying the house, if you can, if you're not buying it at an auction or something as a investor, that if you can go ahead and not have a handyman just cut out the mold, that would be great. Because I see that a lot.
Yeah. I mean, here you have it, guys. So, I hope you guys have learned something from Brad. We're going to publish, like I said, all of his information in the show notes. We'd love to hear from you. If you have comments, questions, and you'd like to reach out to us, please do so. And guys, I think the biggest takeaway here is that to some people, like Brad said, mold's a big deal. Others, it may not affect them as much, but if you have certain reactions to mold, it can be harmful to you, especially if you have asthma, young children. You should definitely not be living in an area with mold. If you are renting, you're a tenant, you should reach out to your landlords and let them know if you think that there's mold in the house so that they can deal with it, because a lot of times they don't know either. So, biggest takeaways here is try not to do it yourself. And I think, more than a 10 square foot area or 3x3 area, kind of use that as a rule of thumb.
No,
get the pros in.
Yeah. So I wouldn't necessarily use that as a rule of thumb. I would go ahead and just, if you have some kind of extreme water damage, call pro, whether it's 3x3 or 1x1, whatever the case is. If you're just seeing a little bit of mold along a baseboard, go ahead. You could probably remove that yourself. If you peel it back and you're seeing a big issue, mold going throughout behind the baseboard throughout the entire wall. But that's what the EPA says is 3x3. So that's kind of why I brought that up.
Gotcha.
Feet. So it's not. There's a huge gray area. Yeah. Unfortunately, we can't cover that in an hour.
Turn to the pros. I appreciate that.
Yep.
And Brad Fishbein here, lookmold. Check him out. Brad, thank you so much, man, for your time.
This was fun.
All right, guys.
Fun. Thank you, Todd. Awesome.
You bet, man. And thank you everybody for watching, and, check us out, hit the subscribe buttons and those bells so that you're alerted when Brad and I have great episodes like this. So have a great night and see you next week.